Welcome to Primal Edge Health. Cutting-edge holistic lifestyle optimization with a focus on nutrition, environment, light, movement, and worldview. Exploring animal-based nutrition, whole unrefined ancestral foods, regenerative agriculture, homesteading, and a holistic lifestyle approach for health, vitality, and optimal performance so we can thrive and bring others along for the ride. Building healthy bodies, homes, families, and communities. Because we are far more than what we eat. Today's episode is brought to you in part by Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. Ancestral Supplements brings you nose-to-tail organ meats like liver, kidney, pancreas, brain, marrow, heart, thymus, thyroid, and more in simple, convenient gel and capsules. Order yours today at ancestralsupplements.com. Now let's get into the meat of this episode of Primal Edge Health. I'm here with Peter Ballerstedt, forage agronomist. He's really into ruminant agriculture. He is a prominent member of a shadowy group called the Ruminati, which we're going to get into today. And we're going to talk all about sustainable agriculture, sustainability being kind of the key word of, I guess, the decade. I mean, we're really hearing a lot about meat being unsustainable, about animal agriculture being so bad for the environment. Ruminant animals and cow farts are allegedly destroying the planet, and that us eating beef, we're told that us eating beef is bad for the earth. So we're going to get into a lot of these myths, the myth of the sustainable vegan diet, and all this stuff today with Peter Ballerstedt. Thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk to us, Peter. How you doing today?
I'm very glad to be here. Doing well, thank you.
Fantastic. So how did you get into the field of agronomy, and what exactly is agronomy? I feel like a lot of people maybe have no idea what I'm talking about when I talk about an agronomist.
Agronomists are those people who work in agriculture, soil management, plant management, crop production, utilization issues. I am trained in the specialty of forage crop or forage agronomy. So those are the crops that are going to be eaten by primarily ruminants, so beef, dairy, sheep, goats, but there are many other kinds, and in other parts of the world, animals like buffalo are more important than cattle are for dairy production, for example. So how I got into it was I grew up in suburbia and discovered that I liked the country more than I liked suburbia, and then got introduced to what farming was like, and then found agronomy as a course of study, and that led to my career a few years ago.
Awesome. So we got a similar background. I also grew up in the suburban sprawl, the cookie cutter homes, stamped out all next to each other. And if you live in a cul-de-sac, you're real lucky because you can play in the street. But we ended up taking a slightly different route and trying to get into food production ourselves at our little homestead here. So I think we've got a lot in common as far as our interests go. So we've been hearing a lot about meat being unsustainable, right? And I've seen a lot of your work. You've done a very good job at debunking some of these myths. So I want to kind of share with the audience a little bit about what it is you do and what you see as being the most sustainable model for food production. So I think one of the major problems today is these terms like sustainability get used essentially in a very propagandistic way, right? We hear about sustainability, and it's such a loaded term at this point. When you hear the word sustainability, like what does that even mean to you, and what do you even think is it's talking about there?
Well, I agree completely that it's become a word that's used almost in a marketing sense. It's like a label claim. And so I'd like to know specifically what we mean by that. And I hope that what I'm able to do is kind of stand between the various tribes that I inhabit. So I am from agriculture. That's my background. That's what I do for a living and have for many years. And I want to introduce that tribe to people from maybe a slightly more scientifically based human nutrition perspective, or people from the metabolic health community that I've been fortunate enough to get to know and read their work, and introduce those tribes to each other. Because if we're not going to talk about the burden of chronic disease when we talk about sustainability, then we're not really having a broad enough, and at times I would suggest honest, conversation about sustainability. The simple truth is that the cost of metabolic illness today is bankrupting our country, the United States, and will bankrupt all countries because it's now a global phenomenon. And if the people that I've come to respect are right, then a diet that includes some amount of animal source food is an absolutely essential reality for humans throughout the world. Now, we can talk about how much animal source food, and I know people who exist on a solely animal source food diet, and that alone is interesting because that pushes back against a lot of the narrative that says, well, a healthy diet is one that gives you healthy whole grains and fruits and vegetables 5 a day. And so there's so many now interwoven narratives into this space that part of my mission, I think, is just to make sure that we stop and we pull it all apart and we test each strand of this rope that we're confronted with and say, is it really that sound a rope, or does it just look impressive because it's so fat? And the more I do that, the less impressed with the rope I am. But on the other hand, I have a heck of a lot of hope, because I think that we have tremendous opportunity to improve the productivity and efficiency of ruminant animal production systems that are tailored to the individual cultures and environments in which they can be run, and the ability for those to produce demonstrable benefits for the environments, the soil, the water, as well as the people that are fed by them. So some days I get kind of pessimistic, but frequently I can pull myself out of it by saying, no, there's room for optimism here.
Yeah, it's not. It doesn't all have to be Beyond Meat and lab grown, Soylent slop from the from the big foundations that are pushing these things. So it's funny, the word sustainability. It's such a squishy term. Like I don't even know what most people mean when they say it, and I think you put it really well. It's kind of a marketing term now, right? I mean, you see it coming from these big Fortune 100 companies talking about, you've got Nestle talking about sustainable development. You've got, the Eat Lancet Foundation, where you've got, Syngenta, Cargill, Bayer, Monsanto, Nestle, Kellogg's talking about sustainable food production. I mean, it's hard for me to even use the word without snickering at this point, because it means everything to everybody, it seems.
Well, and I'll agree with all of that and say that you can find that in any sphere we look at, including ones we belong to.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we kind of get past, yes, the organic Pop-Tarts, right? The organic vegan sugar, right? Okay, what is it? Or cigarettes made with organic tobacco. Okay, that's it. We're done. What do you think you're buying by paying for that? But on the other side, I came into this space having been out of agriculture for a while, I came into it following my own sort of, I read Gary Taubes. Okay, that's the short version of the story, as well as Mike and Mary Dan Eads, as well as many other people. My own health journey. But I brought my background in forage agronomy, grazing management, all of that. And of course, I was convinced it had to be grass-fed. That was all my confirmation bias. Then I started reading the studies that people who are promoting grass-fed cited. And I said, really? This is the basis of, okay. So that's my reminder to myself to be kind of careful with all this, as well as to say, look, everybody's guilty of this to a certain degree. That's human nature. That's why we're supposed to follow science in its real sense, not what we've been subjected to.
So when you say that there are issues with the label grass-fed and that there's some myths concerning grass-fed, I think this is obviously a very hot topic, right? I mean, a lot of people are very, very attached to the grass-fed, grass-finished, right? I mean, I talk to a lot of cattle ranchers who definitely make a great case for the importance of grazing these animals, grazing ruminant animals in a dynamic way, and Alan Savory and the mob grazing techniques for regenerating soil. There are a lot of good arguments there. What might we be missing with assuming that grass-fed is inherently better? What comes to mind when I hear of the grain-fed, one of the issues being the GMO monocrop soy, wheat, and corn. Clearly a lot of people have problems with the massive government subsidies going to corn production, going to wheat production, soy production, and this might not be the best thing for our soil. But what would be an argument that you would posit for perhaps looking beyond dogmatically attaching ourselves to the grass-fed idea?
Well, let's just make sure we understand, in fact, what we're talking about, because globally, ruminant animals, I think the figure is something like, for the global ruminant animal herd, something like 96% of the feed that those animals consume is not human utilizable. Even in the United States, the typical commercial grain finished steer, and we can talk about terms, but that's what I'm talking about. 10% of what that animal consumes on a life cycle basis is human utilizable. The vast majority of 2/3 of the grain that's produced for the ruminant herd, it's less than 10% of the global cereal production goes into ruminants.
And so what is it that they're actually being given? So we get told by vegan activists that, well, most of the corn, most of the wheat, most of the soy is grown to feed cattle, right? Now, why are they saying this, and why might this not be the whole picture?
Well, I probably would be best served by not ascribing motives to an entire group of people as if they're, all the same thing. Let's say the most charitable thing is they're repeating what they've been told by people that they respect.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, they're probably people that influence them becoming vegan. But again, the simple facts are different than what they say. And the facts may require you to be familiar with sources that I'm familiar with because of my background, but they're not that hard to find. So that description is not true. I think in the United States, it's something like 70% of calories in our diet are coming from plant source foods today.
So we're already on a plant-based diet.
Exactly. And I would ask the question, maybe that's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would agree. I would
rather
agree.
than the solution.
Hmm.
Something like almost 60%, I think, are coming from grains, plant lipids that are added, and sweeteners.
Hmm.
Those three categories are produced now. I've seen points people make that say, well, that's not the kind of diet that any vegan, is suggesting. It's like, well, sorry, your cereals. I mean, where are you going to get energy if it's not going to come from carbohydrates or plant lipids?
Yeah.
So, and then that's before we've ever addressed the misunderstanding of protein in human nutrition.
Mm.
So, I think that you have to acknowledge that there's been a tremendous influence in Western thinking about human nutrition from belief systems. Read the work that Belinda Fetke is assembling regarding the role and influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Right. Right.
And then you also have to acknowledge that there's a strain of environmentalism that has been promoting plant source diets. And in fact, they were cited in the original Senate subcommittee report that led to the dietary goals coming out in the 1970s. So these have been fellow travelers, if you will, for a significant period of time. There's a political aspect to all this. And, I just want people to know that if you are, I tried to do it this way, but I think it was one of my good ideas that really wasn't all that good, but I thought it was. So that's why I loved it. Um, are you part of the 88 or are you part of the 12? What the heck are you talking about, Pete? Well, only 88% of adult Americans enjoy optimal metabolic health. Well, what does that mean? Well, we can talk about what that means, but how would you know? Well, okay, there are metrics that are better than what we've been using in our public health messaging and health screenings. The metrics don't include total weight, they don't include BMI, they don't include total cholesterol, they don't include LDL cholesterol. Well, okay, we've just touched on what most people's doctors are going to talk to them about at their last physical, right? In the United States, at least. So we haven't been using good metrics for health assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, we've been using poor metrics in a lot of our soil management. And you asked earlier, regenerative agriculture is another one of those buzzwords.
Mm-hmm.
There are issues that surely we're learning more about. We need to pay attention to those. Organic agriculture is another one of those buzzwords. Organic as a food label is one of those buzzwords. Sustainable agriculture, we've already talked about. The question is, what should humans be eating? I've been telling people that the dietary guidelines, which, again, I don't know how much of your audience is US based, but the dietary guidelines on page 6 of its last edition says it's not intended for the eating pattern that they're recommending is not intended for the treatment of disease. Now, I'm just an agronomist, but my interpretation of that is eat this way, you won't get sick, but if you get sick, don't eat this way. Okay, take you at your word. You're for the 12% you haven't made sick yet. Now, for the 88% that don't enjoy optimal metabolic health, how should they be eating? And we have good suggestion today. And again, we're back to some amount of some animal source food seems to be an essential for human development and health.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, like the work of Weston A. Price when he was looking at healthy populations around the world, found that every single one of them focused heavily on animal foods, right? Plant foods. And I think the whole carnivore movement is very interesting in that, a lot of us are showing that plant foods are actually completely optional, whereas animal foods, the absence of animal foods requires heavy supplementation and is very risky and it can be especially damaging to children, as we see these kids with rickets growing up, with nutrient deficient diets. We see a lot of disease. But it's funny. It's like, you mentioned what cattle are fed, and you said that 10% of what they eat is actually could be consumed by humans, right? So the rest of their diet, what
I'm
exactly?
sorry, yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the rest of
Yeah.
their diet, what exactly is it that they're eating that's not consumable by humans, right? So a lot of
So,
the people they
yeah,
talk about, well,
yeah.
corn, and they'll hear the argument about the monocropping, right? The dangers of monocropping, the degeneration of soil that comes with just drenching everything in glyphosate and using genetically modified patented seeds can be a major issue globally, especially economically. Beyond just the idea of genetic modification, we're looking at the patenting of of life, and so a lot of people have issues with this. And the argument tends to flow in the direction of, well, look, most of these GMO crops, most of the corn and the soy and the wheat that people complain about in like the paleo movement and whatnot, most of those foods are going to cows. But what you're saying is that this is kind of a partial truth.
Well, it's not true at all. The majority of, if you look across cereal grains, the majority goes to human consumption. Um, and then you've got the question of what does, even in the United States, if we look at a typical commercial steer, that is a castrated male animal. The first 5 or 6 months of its life, it's running on pasture next to mama. So it's eating grass or it's ingesting milk that mom made from grass. It's important for people to know that a beef animal does not spend its entire life in a pen or in a cage, that the majority of its life, even in the United States, even grain finished, is spent on pasture. It's also important for people to recognize that even at the end of the feeding period, when the grain, because a ruminant has to have both structural and non-structural carbohydrate. So it has to have fiber, but it also has to have sugar or starch. Now that's in grass, but it can also come from grain. It has to be balanced, proper nutritional practices. Even at the end of the feeding period, even a corn finished steer, 50 to 60% of its ration dry matter is coming from corn. The rest is going to be hay, or it's going to be silage or something of that nature.
And when you say
So
corn, does that mean like actual, corn that would be edible to humans, or was this byproducts of the production? Is it the non-human grade corn? What are we looking at there?
it's both. It's all of that. It can be byproduct feed, so from the ethanol production or distillers' byproducts. It could be off grade, so not human utilizable, or it could be corn that's grown for feed. There are many different kinds of corn that are grown. And that corn would be flaked in some way or processed in some way so that it was of value in a ruminant's ration. A very small percentage of the acreage that produces corn in the United States actually goes to feed beef, for example. Now, one of the values of a ruminant opposed to a monogastric is that ruminants are effective at converting fiber into fat. And they're also very effective at upcycling poor quality protein into very high quality protein. And one of the really unfortunate things that's happened over the last several decades is work that should have been taking place in human nutrition hasn't, because we've been distracted by these false trails, to put it mildly.
And these false trails are kind of seem to be a lot of economic incentive to follow these down the line, right? I mean, we're looking at a lot of very profitable food being marketed to us as healthy, when in reality it's kind of junk.
Absolutely, and which comes first is a open question, right? But it's clear that we in human nutrition are several decades behind where people are in swine nutrition. Because in swine nutrition, we balance rations on the amino acid basis, which is where we were told we should be working in human nutrition about 15 years ago. But we're nowhere near being able to do that. So when most people look at a food table and they see a protein value listed, they don't realize that what they're looking at is a crude protein value, which is not true protein, let alone the individual indispensable amino acids that we must have, hence their name. And the great thing that a ruminant animal can do is it can take non-protein nitrogen, and because of all those microorganisms that exist within the rumen, those microorganisms capture that non-protein nitrogen, make microbial protein out of it, and then essentially the ruminant host eats the microbes and digests them and their microbial protein content.
I mean, it's such an elegant, beautiful system, right? I mean, it's so simple, right? You can have these animals in your own yard converting indigestible food into digestible, assimilable protein. But you look on paper and you see some lentils, and they tell you, oh, it's got this many grams of protein. But when you see how many grams of protein are in something like broccoli or spinach, why is that not as good as protein from beef? What's the difference, Peter?
Well, again, protein is made up of amino acids. The protein that's listed is actually a crude protein value. And the way that value is derived is we analyze a sample for its nitrogen content. Then we multiply that percent nitrogen value by 6.25. Because we assume in doing that all of the nitrogen that was in that sample was in protein, and all of that protein was 16% nitrogen. In animal source foods, that's okay. You're not too far wrong. In plants, there's a big problem with that. And again, animal nutrition has known about this for over half a century, which is why I push hard against some of the narratives that are coming at us, because they just bring this human nutrition nonsense along with them and want to tell us how we should be doing better in agriculture.
And we see a lot of push now. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
And I want to say, get your organic fertilizer together first, and then come back and talk to us. If the demand changes, the supply changes.
And we're seeing a big demand being created now for the so-called plant-based proteins, right? I mean, we're seeing guys like James Cameron, major investor in some of these, one of the biggest pea protein isolate. Doesn't that sound delicious? One of the biggest pea protein isolate.
Which, by the way, no longer qualifies to be labeled as a good source of protein.
And why would that not qualify?
Because the DIAS value for it is too low.
When you say DIAS, what do you mean by that? What is the DIAS value?
It is a score, which acronym digestible indispensable amino acid score. If people look it up, they can find papers on it. Basically, they're trying to score protein or score food on the basis of those indispensable amino acids we talked about, which, by the way, we get all we need from animal source foods and we don't from plant source foods.
And it's easily digested from animal source foods, right? I mean, it's
highly digested. Exactly right. Whereas even though we might get lysine, for example, from pea isolate, protein isolate, it isn't all digestible to the same degree. So the digestibility varies from food to food, as well as the content varying from food to food. So people have had these ideas about how you can create, right, a plant-only source diet, and yet they don't have the information they need to do that accurately.
No, you're looking at it on paper and they're thinking, okay, well, great. This has, I'm getting this much protein when I eat 10 bananas, and I'm getting this much protein from broccoli and from peas. And if I take my pea protein isolate powder or eat my Beyond Burger, I'm going to get this much protein. But it's not so simple, is it?
No, and at the same time, you're not also getting the other essential nutrition that comes from animal source foods.
The fat-soluble vitamins and whatnot too, right?
Exactly. And so we now have, again, it's a big world. It looks different depending on where you are. We now have studies where the intervention was giving a pregnant woman 1 egg a day. 1 egg a day. And then while she's nursing, because breast milk is an animal source food, isn't it? Yes, I'm pretty sure it is. Giving her 1 egg a day while she's breastfeeding. And we can measure scholastic and cognitive differences in her child relative to women and their children that didn't get that simple intervention. These people are willing to stand up and say that animal source food is essential for the proper human development and function. The thing that drives me crazy is 10 minutes later in their same presentation, they haven't even sat down yet. They start talking about, but not too much. Because there's this mythology about too much animal source food creating problems.
Right. Well, we got cholesterol. You've got there's a lot of different myths, right? That freak people out.
Too much makes you fat. Too much gives you heart disease. Too much, right? All those stories. And so I'm hoping that by bringing us all together, we can begin examining both ends of that malnutrition spectrum. Right? We have children that obviously don't get enough, either in utero or when they're breastfeeding or in early childhood. We also have humans, adults, sorry, to say that children aren't humans. Sorry, I didn't say that. Adults, especially older adults. Here's a little thing. People talk very confidently about how there's too many human beings, that's the problem. Right? And, that story looks a little different depending on where you are in the world. Yeah. But according to the statistics that I'm familiar with, there's about 2 billion children 15 years and under today out of 7.5. Right? So by 2100, they're projecting that there's going to be 10 billion people in the world. I've seen numbers that vary around that, but let's say that's the number. How many children 15 years and under are there going to be? The answer is 2 billion. There's not going to be more children. It's that we're going to get to live longer. So when people start talking about too many people, what exactly are you proposing as the solution here? Because it's not that there's going to be more children.
Yeah, no, I mean it's crazy to hear this. I mean it really irks me to hear the overpopulation myth, which I definitely believe that overpopulation is a myth, and it's a very arrogant claim to make the assertion that you understand and know how many people there should be is so arrogant to me, and it's just so frightening that.
Yes.
And we've got a
Yes.
whole generation. I mean, look, you mentioned. It looks different in different parts of the world, and you're absolutely right. I mean, we're barely at replacement level birth rates in most Western countries, right? As the world develops, the fertility rates decline dramatically, and I mean, you get the Rand Corporation has actually put out studies about this. So you've got people like Paul Ehrlich talking about the population bomb back in the day. So it's another one of these catchphrases it's meant to make us fearful about the population growth. And a lot of kids these days, they don't have any aspirations to have families. They don't have any aspirations to have children at all. So there's a lot of behavioral aspects that are leading to the decline in population. But it seems like there's a nutritional aspect as well. So we're big proponents of eating nose to tail. Whether you're on a ketogenic diet, or a carnivorous diet, or a diet that focuses heavily on animal foods but still includes some carbohydrates for performance, we are big proponents of eating nose to tail, using the whole animal. And that's why we included an entire section on how to prepare nutrient-dense organs, nose to tail, in the Carnivore Cookbook, zero-carb recipes for people who really love animals, which you can find at primaledgehealth.com. Today's episode is brought to you in part by Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. Ancestral Supplements brings you nose-to-tail organ meats like liver, kidney, pancreas, brain, marrow, heart, thymus, thyroid, and more in simple, convenient gel and capsules. We know that a lot of people are trying to include more organs in the diet. A lot of people are trying to focus on the deep nutritional benefits that we get from eating nose to tail, and it can be a little bit overwhelming when you're first starting out. If you're unable to source these things, if you travel a lot and want something that you can bring with you to make sure that you're covering all your nutritional needs on the road, Ancestral Supplements offers liver, kidney, pancreas, brain, bone marrow, and more in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. We often recommend Ancestral Supplements to our clients in the Keto and Carnivore Collective, our monthly community coaching course to help you dial in your diet and lifestyle so that you can live optimally. They're called Ancestral Supplements, but these are really whole, unrefined foods. Dried, grass-fed, grass-finished beef organs in convenient gelatin capsules for you and your family. There's a lot of behavioral aspects that are leading to the decline in population, but it seems like there's a nutritional aspect as well, right? I mean, you
Yes.
mentioned human health being affected by
guess
diet.
just to wrap that last point up, what we now know is as we age, and having just turned 63 myself, this is of a concern, we humans get less efficient at utilizing protein.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, we need more high quality protein in our diet. So our dietary recommendations have been driven by a misunderstanding of protein from our foods and by a lack of a sophisticated understanding of monogastric nutrition. Again, we've been distracted. And this idea that there's a one size fits all protein requirement for humans. Okay. All of that's we're just, no, wrong, stop.
Right. Like a sedentary person versus a high-level athlete, right? I mean, an adult 30-year-old female versus a 63-year-old man. I mean, these very, very different protein requirements.
Exactly right. So on their final exam, I don't even give them partial credit. And yet these are people who influence conversations globally about what sort of diet we ought to be eating, and therefore what sort of food system they ought to be engineering on a global basis. Sorry, stop. Not going to go there. You don't understand enough to even be in a freshman level class on the subject.
Yeah.
So however you got to the position you're in, we need to have a conversation about just how misinformed you are. Now back to people who aren't perhaps to the level of understanding of some of the subjects that I've been taught in. And a lot of what I'm doing is just reading information that you get taught in these subjects.
Hmm.
It's not that hard. So sustainability, what is the healthcare footprint, right? And that footprint looks a lot different when you're in South Africa dealing with a diabetes epidemic
Hmm.
than it looks in the affluent West, where we're also having a diabetes epidemic.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Both
Um,
places.
yeah, India has a rampant problem without necessarily having the obesity
Yeah. Shortest life
aspect.
expectancy in the world is in India, and very, very high diabetes rates as well, but low obesity. What are they eating?
Mhm.
I mean, they're notorious. I mean, people talk about the plant-based diet. You look at a plant-based population, primarily plant-based. India is not doing too well as far as health goes, is it?
No, so if you're starving, you have one problem. Well, that's it, and you solve that problem by eating whatever is available, right? And to the point of, and I think you alluded to it earlier, as societies become more prosperous, we can afford to invest in things like conservation. When you don't have to have 6 children in order for two to survive, then birth rate comes down. Um, and these are all things that we should be working on, but again, we've been distracted by these other narratives and worldviews and frankly vested interests. So you mentioned specific um, meat replacement or alternative foods, and there's an absolute vested interest in all of that, as well as belief system, etc. So back to the role of livestock globally. And one of the roles of livestock agriculture globally is food security for the people that are pastoralists.
Yeah.
It is a survival strategy for people that makes them less dependent on the distribution channels. Should they be given better information and better infrastructure so they can profit from it to a greater degree? Absolutely. But one of the things that happens is it's a source of new wealth generation. It enables the poor to elevate themselves out of poverty. What's your solution, Mr. Impossible or Mr. Beyond? You don't have one because that's not your interest.
Right, right. And the
Um,
big corporate, these global corporations, they want to make people more dependent on their foods. They want to remove people's ability to actually produce their own foods, and they're open about
well,
this.
that's certainly an outcome of it. Again, ascribing motivation, whatever. Let's just be honest and say that people don't become more food secure by putting their entire dependency on a distribution channel
Yeah.
that has to somehow be maintained in parts of the world where you don't have good infrastructure.
Right. Well, I mean, Henry Kissinger told a journalist, he said, you control oil, you control the nations, you control food, you control the people. So there are people who look at this. It might not be, Pat Brown from Beyond, or was it from Impossible Inc., might not understand these greater concepts, but geopolitically, food systems have been understood as control mechanisms for generations.
Yeah.
This is
So
ancient knowledge.
here's an example, and these are people that I'm trying to get better integrated with, but
Mm.
you can take really simple information and deliver it to pastoralists around the world and have a profound impact. So in Nepal, for example, the dairy industry is based on buffalo.
Hmm.
Where do you think we get mozzarella cheese from? Real mozzarella. In Italy, it comes from buffalo, not from cattle.
Nice.
Okay, so in what they did was they just took very simple, straightforward, basic, what we call dry cow treatment and management. So a cow is not milked 365 days out of the year. She typically is allowed to dry off for 2 months or so, or less, depends. In some parts of the world, less. But the buffalo, if you don't treat those animals appropriately, well, sorry, back up and just say, by teaching the dairymen there these basic tools and knowledge, they took the mastitis infection rate from 75% to 15%.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that has an environmental effect. That has an animal welfare effect. That has an economic effect. All of those just by distributing basic information that we've known in the West for a couple generations
So
now.
when you say that when they let them dry up, you mean, they let them dry up and then they impregnate them, right? Because I mean once the animal dries up, it's not going to start producing milk again until it's impregnated,
Well,
right?
but the animal's already pregnant.
Okay.
So, if you think of it as a 9-month cycle from insemination to calving, then you're going to have the first several months of that lactation, which starts with calving, where the animal is not pregnant. Then the animal's going to start cycling. You're going to then breed either naturally with a bull or artificially inseminate.
Yeah.
And now you hopefully have that cow pregnant so that she will calve again 9 months later, so
Yeah.
that she's calving every 12 months.
So
That's
she's having almost a year time where she's not being fed on, right? So she's free of.
Well, so she's lactating for, let's say, 9 to 10 months.
Mm-hmm.
And it depends. I mean, United States, if you had somebody who was seasonally grass-based only as a dairyman,
Yeah.
you'd want that cow to give a calf again. You want all your cows to calve within a very short time period. You'd want them all to come at about 12 months later.
Yeah.
And so you want to time that so that it's best matched to your forage or pasture resource.
Right.
This is common in New Zealand. It's common in other parts of the world. You want their feed demand to be lowest when your feed supply is lowest.
Mm-hmm.
That's better economics for you. So yeah, out of a 12-month cycle, 3 months or so of that, you're probably not going to be milking the animal, but she's going to be pregnant at that time.
Yeah.
So I guess we've touched on this already. I think that there's a big part of this message that's coming against the consumption of animal source food that doesn't value human life appropriately. And so the fact that somebody can say, eating this way, I have restored my metabolic health, I am at lower risk of chronic disease, et cetera,
Yeah.
people are like, yeah, but what about the environmental impact? And I'm saying, really? Really?
Well, I mean, what are they assuming that the environmental impact is? I mean, what are they thinking? Are they thinking methane? Are they thinking, oh, the cow poop's somehow bad? I mean, and a lot of these are, there's a lot of these are partial truths, half truths, or complete untruths when people are believing that, animal agriculture is somehow detrimental.
Absolutely. And part of it is, and you have to deconstruct the impact of whatever emissions. Yeah. Right, so they misrepresent the emissions. We can just stop there. They talk about this as if it is the most significant source of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
That's simply
methane,
not true.
Right? Methane and CO2.
Well, because what we do is we convert methane into a CO2 equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of ways in that conversion that you can misrepresent it. But the most fundamental way that you can misrepresent it is to ignore the fact that whatever methane a cow is going to emit comes from the food she ingested. right?
Mm-hmm.
She's not an alchemist. She's not creating these elements. She's part of a natural cycle.
Right. It's not like the methane
And
is being created out of thin air and it's just going to linger there forever and destroying the planet.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so what happens in a big sort of picture way is we have CO2 from the atmosphere being fixed by photosynthesis in a plant into carbohydrate. That carbohydrate then is eaten by a ruminant. In the rumen, a percentage of that carbohydrate gets reduced to methane, which gets burped out. It's a portion, it's not the entire amount. That methane that gets burped out in 10 years or less, it's oxidized back to CO2. So this is a cycling of CO2.
Yeah.
It's not an enrichment of the atmosphere, as opposed to when we burn fossil fuels, or when we extract methane, or when we manufacture nitrogen fertilizer from natural gas. We then end up enriching the content in the atmosphere. So fundamentally different, yet they get talked about as if they're the same. Again, this is part of the misrepresentation.
Yeah.
And I understand that I'm geeky and I like to drill into all this and I get distracted. I think it's fundamentally important for people to understand that chronic disease has an environmental impact. And even if it were less, I value their health and the health of their families to a greater degree than the people who are yelling loudest about all this.
Well, even at a hedonistic level, it's no fun to be around a bunch of sick, miserable people, is it? I mean, just environmentally, as far as socially, who wants to be around a bunch of people who are sick and dying?
So one of my lines is to tell people that when you improve your health, you are improving the world. And that is to say, think, you being healthy has an impact on your family. You being healthy has an impact on your economics. Your being healthy has an impact on your employer or your employees. And there are real issues that need to be addressed globally. And because when you are healthy, you then have the opportunity to work in those areas, which aren't there when you're not healthy, because you're just sort of drawn into this world of chronic illness.
Yeah.
And so, and so many of these conversations about saving the world or whatever, you're not going to achieve that, right? Adele Height, who is someone that I recommend everyone read, but she said that Americans love the idea of saving the world by shopping.
Yeah, it's the consumer religion that we've been fed. I mean, it's it's decades of consumer religion drilled into us, and the generational effect of that is
indeed.
staggering.
I mean, it's a way to, my reusable grocery bag means I'm a better person than you.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
It's a way to assuage our guilt without having to do anything, which is perfect.
Yeah.
The idea that it's this virtue signaling. I don't want to give up my corporate jet, but I'm going to fly to this, confab where we'll talk about global warming and the need for everybody to stop eating beef.
Leonardo DiCaprio, right? And you got the people who own private islands and party with, champagne and on their private islands on yachts and fly to the UN to tell us all that we need to stop having babies because our babies are toxic byproducts of human reproduction. They're going to destroy the planet. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't begrudge you the wealth that you've achieved. I don't begrudge you the things that enables you to enjoy for yourself and your family. Um, the reality, I think I remember who said this, but I'm not going to give them credit because I might be getting it badly wrong. But the people who talk loudest about changing the world are the people that tend to not be doing the work to change themselves.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the irony, I mean, first of all, to do that is humbling and humiliating, and it's hard work. And the irony, though, is that if we would all do that, change ourselves in whatever way is appropriate, we would change the world,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And yet here we have these people who, what hell hath no fury like a vested interest masquerading as a virtue. Um, and so part of the pushback, I think, is that people are coming to recognize
Yeah.
the fallacy of these arguments. And so they're just getting shriller in making them. But that doesn't mean they can't still do large amounts of mischief.
No, I mean it's an
Part,
industry. I mean the culture creation industry it's powerful. I mean you see the what's it called, the climate action thing. What was it? Greta Thunberg and
oh,
the
Eat Lancet.
the Eat Lancet. That's one of them. But I was thinking of the
Greta. Yeah, well,
what was that group
so at
called?
some point we can talk about child abuse, but
Right.
and we have historical references from like Salem, when teenage girls were used to accuse people of various crimes, and people died as a result until that mania ended, which some have suggested actually was the result of ergot poisoning, which is interesting. Um, which didn't come from eating animal source food, by the way. It came from eating infected grain products. But I digest once again. So what I want people to get, what is it? The secret of enlightenment is to lighten up. People are worried about things that I think they've been told they should be worried about.
Mm-hmm.
And as you've said, and as we've alluded to, there's a reason they told you to worry about those, and it might not be because it's worth worrying about.
Right. Might have more to do with with control over
Other
resources, right? I mean, it's.
other things,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So back to, a lot of us get into this space because we're interested in our own health.
Yeah.
And I think fallacy for anyone to say, if you eat this way, you will avoid chronic diseases. I don't think anyone can say that. I know that the people who have influenced dietary guidelines didn't have the data to support that. And so, again, I think we can't fix the problems by making the same mistakes again. But what we do have information on is people who are talking about, yes, it's anecdotal, although we're getting a lot more information now. If you have these chronic conditions and you eat this way, the chronic condition gets better, or it resolves completely or reverses. I mean, we have that information now, and we certainly have enough people who suffer from those conditions that they need to hear that. And part of what I see is a lot of the people that I really respect in agriculture don't know any of that. And so if we could just, I think it was Gary Taubes whose next book is based on talking to many different practitioners,
Mm-hmm.
who either themselves or had their own personal experience, or they had a patient whose experience transformed their thinking.
Yeah.
Right. And so he's now talking about multiplying the personal experience. So how do we do that? How do we get more people aware of this? And to the degree that I can help somebody dump the guilt, right, for restoring their health, I'm happy to do that. And to the degree that we can get more people aware of the absolute requirement for some amount of animal source food in human diet, then the question, how are we going to produce that? How are we going to do it globally in a way that is appropriate for the environments and the cultures involved?
Yeah. Or how about locally, right? How about locally in a local environment
Well,
rather than.
locally is fine, but if you live in Maine, for example, you're not going to graze 365 days out of the year,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Exactly.
If you live in New Mexico without irrigation, you've got some constraints there that don't exist in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And evidence of agriculture actually, evidence of trade far precedes agriculture, but it may be that agriculture, one, was a natural outcome of our trading nature,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
What can I produce in this environment that I can exchange with you and your environment?
Yeah.
And number two is it may have also come because of some natural transitions in our environment. That's a longer story for me to get into later. But there's this, again, local has a cost too. And doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be done in an appropriate way. But local agriculture isn't necessarily the least footprint of other options, right? So again, it's part of what I push back against, if only to get people to take a look at, the big picture. We have to acknowledge that we are heterotrophic organisms. We have to consume other organisms. We can't eat raw rock. And in order to produce food, produce those other organisms, we're not going to be hunter-gatherers. Fortunately, because we can actually spare the environment and the wildlife that we live in if we can adopt appropriate agricultural systems. But then the question is, what are those impacts of the agricultural systems, as enlightened as they may be, and how do we make them as little as possible?
No, but what do you think about like monocropping, right? So you got a lot of people in the global food system that we're looking at now, which is highly destructive. It involves heavy use of pesticides, which destroy our gut and destroy the soil. I mean, glyphosate's actually patented as an antibiotic, and it's sprayed heavily on many
Yeah, I'm
crops.
going to let's kind of leave glyphosate on the shelf, because I think glyphosate has become used as a tool to fight genetically modified organisms. And a lot of things are said about glyphosate that when I actually go into the literature, I don't find
I mean,
I understand.
we know that it's patented as an antibiotic. I mean, it opens up the tight junctions in the gut, and it allows.
Well,
I mean, this
so
is proven.
we know its mode of action.
Yeah.
And we also know that it's been around for a significant period of time.
And during this time,
And,
the cancer rates have gone up astronomically. I mean, there
well,
have been court cases where.
so we're now going to say association proves causation, which is
I mean,
how we got into the.
this is Monsanto puts billions of dollars into attacking people with with its science, but I mean we're looking at something that's pretty obvious that it's very detrimental. And it chelates the soil, it destroys the soil.
No, it does not. No, it does not.
It's
And
patented
again,
as an antibiotic, as a chelating antibiotic. It binds to
it's
manganese.
not a chelate. Do you know what? Sorry, we may need to excise this.
Uh huh.
But do you know the chemical structure of glyphosate?
I'm not looking at it right now, but it's patented as an
Right.
antibiotic.
Well, but an antibiotic can be salt.
True, and you salt the soil, you can destroy the soil as well.
But no. Sorry. Let's take it one step at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it was patented as, you do mass screenings of substances. I've got battery check warning coming up. You do mass screenings of substances to find biological activity. As soon as you find anything, you file on it to protect yourself. Then you continue to do the development. Okay, my master's in science, so I'm somewhat familiar with the area. Okay, chelate is an enormous compound in relationship to it's a glycine molecule with phosphate stuck on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very simple molecule that gets bound in the soil very quickly. I understand, I've heard the people talk about this, but I've also seen a lot of stuff. So I would suggest, with all respect, to treat that area with a block of salt, because I don't think it's going to do your credibility any good to tie yourself to that without knowing.
I mean, I could say the same thing to you. I could say the same thing to you. I could levy the same argument.
Well, but my role here is to act as a bridge between agricultural community to you. And so I'm trying to just say that it can't function as a chelate. It's just not a chemical possibility.
Does it not bind to manganese in the soil?
No.
No.
It does. It cannot do that.
It cuts off the plant's ability to take up nutrients from the soil, and that's how it kills the plants, right?
That's not its mode of action.
What's its mode of action?
It interferes with a specific point of protein synthesis in a way that exists only in plants.
Yeah.
So
it has no effect. It has no effect on animals.
The ischemic pathway does not exist in animals. It exists in plants.
So glyphosate's not. So what you're saying is, I'm trying to get where you're going with this. Glyphosate's not bad for humans?
Yeah, the glyphosate is not the concern. And I understand. Yeah. I've heard a lot of stuff, and I see a lot of passion.
Yeah.
And it's a struggle for me how to navigate this space, because I'm trying to be helpful and I'm trying to.
What do you think about the millions of dollars that Bayer Monsanto has to pay now to the people who've sued them for the cancers that have allegedly resulted?
So the courtroom is a really bad jurisdiction to adjudicate science.
So you don't think glyphosate has anything to do with the increased cancer rates and all that?
I do not.
Okay.
Certainly. Let's take it back a step and say, do you believe that cancer is a metabolic illness?
It can be. It can also be viral.
Yeah, I'm more convinced that it's a metabolic disease than I am that it's a somatic mutation accumulation disease, which is the existing current model.
Yeah, but I mean, it can be induced virally, which I get. Metabolic disorders can be induced virally as well, right?
Point.
Yeah.
But so what we have is this epidemic of metabolic derangement that has existed, right, for the last period of time. So the analogy that I use is, I've got a wooden rain barrel, right?
Yeah.
And the staves that make up the rain barrel are of different length. The amount of water that barrel's going to hold is going to be determined by the shortest stave in the barrel.
Yeah.
Right? Now, I can tweak those longer ones by whatever, inputs I want to do or manipulations. But I can't increase the amount of water it's going to hold until I increase the length of that short stave.
Yeah.
Okay. Metabolic illness at this point, from everything that I've read and the people that I get to listen to, is the short stave. At some point down the road, likely, inevitably, we'll see other factors come into play once we've addressed metabolic, insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, let's just call it that. Once we've addressed that, then we're going to find other things. But until we do, anyone who speaks confidently about it being able to discern a signal without accounting for that massive signal of hyperinsulinemia, it's highly unlikely.
Okay. Yeah. No, definitely. Hyperinsulinemia is massive issue. We see diabetes and cancer, heart disease, and their implications with all of these major ailments and illnesses. That hyperinsulinemia seems to be a major player in all that. But back to the monocropping thing. What do you think about the mass production of corn and soy? I mean, what about do you think that this is an environmentally neutral or possibly beneficial or even environmentally detrimental aspect of our food production system globally? The genetically modified corn and wheat and soy, the patented seeds. Well, wheat's not GMO, but the patented seeds and the monocropping. What do you think about this model? Do you think this is something we should assess or maybe expand, perhaps, or how should we look at these things?
Well, I think it's being assessed in various parts of the world in different ways. So we have people now looking at the whole aspect of soil health is a big title. You mentioned regenerative agriculture, and clearly that's a critical component to that idea. So we have people who are looking at how do we put together rotations so that we're not just going corn on corn on corn on corn, for example.
Yeah.
Or we're looking at ways that we can produce annual crops without necessarily plowing every year.
Yeah.
And there's a number of practices that are involved in that. But the idea of keeping soil covered, keeping something growing in it for as long as possible, my point is, well, the best way to do that is, of course, perennial forage crops. But you're still going to have to face the fact that these annual crops produce more yield per acre than we're going to be able to do off most grass systems. It's just the nature of the biology. But how much of that needs to be done? Well, if we weren't told that our diets need to be based on carbohydrates, maybe it would look a little different. In other parts of the world, they're doing things which some in the US we call silvopastoral. Other parts they talk about agroforestry. So the idea that you can plant trees and grow crops or grass in between these widely spaced rows of trees. While the trees are growing, you can produce a crop or you can graze cattle or whatever the livestock are, and then you've got multiple systems going on. So there's lots of ways for this to change. We have what we have for a number of reasons. You did mention that there's no such thing as GMO wheat, which again, people make that mistake and they say, I work for a seed industry or seed company, a grass seed company. We produce all of our varieties through traditional plant breeding and selection process. You mentioned plant patenting. It can take us 15 to 20 years to bring a new variety to market. Well, we don't do that as a company if we can't protect our investment in doing that. So plant variety protection is a real thing, and it enables the improvement of the crops that farmers have available to grow. So, one of the ways that you can reduce your environmental footprint is to increase the yield per acre, because then you don't need as many acres to produce whatever the necessary amount is.
So, are you saying that the GMO crops and the monocropping is a way of producing more food per acre, and that this is like a benefit?
Well, it has a benefit that has to be weighed against the cost.
Yeah.
And then the absolute, the monoculture is a monolithic, if you will, application. It can look differently. So if somebody's doing a no-till cover crop corn, where when the corn's growing, it's the only thing growing, that looks different, at least to me, than if somebody were planting corn with conventional tillage and did nothing after that corn was harvested until the next growing season when they plant corn again.
Yeah.
So exactly what's this looking like? In Brazil, where I got to visit, they were growing, I think I'll get this right, in September they'd plant soybeans. And then in January, so they are using a tropical perennial grass, but they have to kill it. Then they plant in without tillage. They plant the soybeans. January, they harvest the soybeans. They then plant corn in like February, along with that same grass again. Even though it's a perennial, they're managing it as a short rotation. Then come, I think it was June, they'd harvest the corn, and they'd let that grass grow until September.
Yeah.
Because the grass then gets released, and now it gets sun, and now it grows. They hadn't yet started to put livestock into this growing system, but what they were saying was they had to have like 10,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare accumulated, or their organic matter levels declined. Soil quality decreased. It's the subtropical, tropical region. The soils are heavily weathered to begin with.
Yeah.
If they didn't do that, that soils degrade, which is part of the issue that we're facing globally. Yeah. I just got a 12-minute warning on my battery.
Oh, battery's blasting us.
Power.
Yep, there we go. Well, yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation, man. I really appreciate you coming on, Peter. You give a very interesting perspective on a lot of these issues. And where can people find more of your work? And what would you, if you have any, closing statements, if you have anything else you want to hit on that we didn't get to hit on before your battery dies? I know you got a lot on your mind. You got a lot of, you're very passionate about what you do, and you enjoy what you do. And I'm sure we could talk for much longer about some of these things. But anything else you want to drop on the audience here, who I'm sure are very interested in the conversation?
Well, again, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity and the conversation. It's enjoyable, and the patience and persistence with the technology. I want people, so the challenge is you live where you live and I live where I do, and I don't know where people are going to be dialing in from. In the United States, I want people to know that they can go to the supermarket and they can buy the appropriate food for their diet and their experience, whatever they can afford, and they can do that with confidence. It's safe, it's healthful, it's nutritious,
so
right?
They're not destroying the planet by eating meat.
They're not destroying the planet.
Okay.
And that's probably the biggest thing. And then also to let people know that these are very complicated issues. There's a lot of nuance to them. There's a lot of details. And part of my mission, it seems, is just to make sure that people are introduced to the information. Because I think the most important thing for people to understand is this role of a species-appropriate diet in metabolic health restoration and maintenance. And there's a lot of other stuff that I frequently run into within that community, which if my people from other tribes come in contact, it puts that metabolic health message credibility at risk. And it's not to say that people shouldn't talk about things that they're concerned about. It's just to let people know that they maybe ought to re-examine some of that in light of some other information, right? Because I can be wrong. It's always good for human beings to keep that in mind. But if I'm right, the most important thing for people to do is to restore their metabolic health.
All right. So health over...
Where to find me? Grass-Based Health on Facebook. Grass-Based, one word, on Twitter and Instagram. You can email me at peter.ballerstedt@gmail.com. And you can find me on YouTube. Lots of talks are posted. I have a channel. My specific name is how to find my channel. I'm getting yelled at again.
Right on, man. Grass-based, Peter Ballerstedt. Forage, agronomy, very, very interesting conversation. Much appreciated that you took the time out of your day to come on. There you go. You're back here. So, guys, make sure to check out Peter's work. Grass-based, Peter Ballerstedt. And, you guys can find more at primaledgehealth.com as well. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Peter, and have a great day.
Thank you, Tristan. Take care. Good